Okay, so just to give a quick summary of some of the general themes that we discussed in the past, and then we're going to go to the fourth and final section today. So as we discussed, in general, there are about, I guess you could say, roughly 4 sections to the song. The first 2 sections describe the various perspectives. First, the perspective of the young woman, and then the perspective of the young man. And it talks about the challenges of this relationship. And in the metaphor, the woman is looking for her beloved. He's not exactly present. He's not exactly telling her where he is. He's not exactly telling her where to find her. There's other problems in the first song. And the first song is that they're at a party and all of a sudden there's a terrible smell. And that's the first song. The second song is the perspective of the groom. And the perspective of the groom is that he comes to his beloved and he says, let's go out. Can't you see that everything is so wonderful? It's the springtime. All the flowers are blossoming. The birds are singing. It's wonderful. Nature's coming back to life. Can we get together and go out in the fields together? And in response, she can't do that. She says, I'm not available. I have to guard the vineyard. There are foxes that are here. And at the end of the day, she's not able to do what he wants. She can't unite with him. And the commentaries that we quoted talk about that. That's the metaphor. But the interpretation of the metaphor is this trying to build this relationship, sort of the dating period between God and the Jewish people. And that covers the period of Egypt, the exodus from Egypt, and the being in Israel until the times of Solomon. And again, different commentators highlight different historical events that line up to these stories. But what they have in common is that somehow the relationship, somehow the connection, is a disalignment. When the people are inspired, they don't really understand God's perspective. And ultimately, while the relationship is there, while the relationship is being built, while there is an engagement period or a period of dating, but the relationship has not yet been fully established. And that's just the nature of things. It takes time for this relationship to develop, especially because the people and the characters are so different from each other. They come from different perspectives. One is the king, one is a simple girl from the Judean desert, from Ein Gedi. And that's a lot of the tension between these two people, is that their perspectives are so different. So that is the first 2 songs. The third song, which we also discussed, is somehow the wedding and the aftermath of the wedding. So there's this wedding with Solomon, and everybody seems to be happy because seemingly this is what we all waited for. Finally, the bride and groom got together. She emerges from the desert, as the verse says, Mizot Oleh min hamidbar. She emerges from the desert, and they're ready, and she joins King Solomon, and there's the wedding the wedding between the two, and now you would expect the relationship to be solidified and strengthened. Okay, beautiful. Problem is that right after the song, relatively quickly, right after the wedding, we have this scene where she is indoors, he is outside, he's knocking on the door, he's saying it's raining, he's saying please open up, and she is not ready to open up. She says, well, I'm lying in bed, I already took off my garment, I already washed my feet, because remember in those days the floor is earth, so before you get onto your bed you wash your feet. And if you're going to have to go off your bed again to open the door, and then once again go on your bed, you're going to have to wash your feet again. Nobody wants to wash their feet again in the middle of the night. So she is delaying, and finally, ultimately, she does get inspired to open the door because she sees how he's insisting that she open the door. Finally, she comes and she opens the door, and he is gone because he already left because he did not think she's going to open. So this is a strange phenomenon. Right after the wedding, you would expect that everything should be, they should be living together in bliss and happily ever after. but that's not the case. And again, that's the metaphor. And the interpretation is that after the wedding, not everything went perfect. In other words, once the temple was built, that was not the end of the relationship. That the relationship did not reach tranquility. In fact, right after that, there was separation. And you can read it in two different ways. You can read it as we discussed last week. You can read it as the period of the first temple, where the people, even though the first temple was in existence, the people were serving idols. And that's the separation. And that's God sending, knocking on the door, is sending the prophets. And the prophet and the people are not responding to the prophets. And by the time they do respond to the prophets, it's a little bit too late. And that's why the temple is destroyed. That's the period of mourning we're in today, commemorating that. Today happens to be the first of Av, and the 9 days leading up to the 9th of Av is the intensification of the mourning period. And the point is that God was knocking on the door. We were married. God was knocking on the door, and we were too busy. We were too busy to open. Not too busy. We were too lazy. And like the commentaries explain, that laziness means that you have old habits. And if you have your old habits, it's very difficult to change them and to develop new habits. So the prophet, quote the verses where the Jewish people say, we have already developed the habits of idol worship. So to let go of that is going to be a little bit difficult. So that is one interpretation of that post-wedding period, the period, and this knocking of the door. It's either God sending the prophets during the first period of the temple, or another interpretation was that it's a little bit later in history. It's referring to the Babylonian exile, and that's why you have separation. God's knocking on the door as God is sending messages that the time for the redemption has arrived, and that's why the rulers, the king of Persia, who was then ruled the area, Koresh or Cyrus, gave permission to build the temple. Only a few Jews decided to leave the comforts of Babylonia and go to Israel, and that's God knocking on the door. By the time more Jews went, it was already too late, meaning to say that the moment has passed and the permission has been revoked. And later when it was given, but it was not a full redemption because the Jews did not respond. So that's the two ways of reading about the tension after the wedding. So those are the three sections we discussed up till this point. And that's just by way of summary. And now we're going to read the next couple of chapters, chapters 6, 7, 8. We may conclude the book today. If we don't conclude the book today, maybe we'll do one more class. After that, we'll decide what we want to continue, either continue on to another book or a deeper interpretation in this book, because there's still so much to say. But for the first round, I'm just trying to give a general overview. And what is the period of, what is this book talk, what is the fourth section of the book refer to? So we're in exile, we're in separation. So how do you determine the present and the future? How do you interpret the exile? So one way to interpret the exile is that the couple did not get along, so they separated, and the love is no longer there. And in these chapters, from chapter 6 to the end of the book, both you have from various perspectives, both from the perspective of the woman, as well as the perspective of the man, as well as the perspective of the audience. In other words, the bystanders, in other words, the people around town, all highlight the great connection and the great love that exists between the man and woman. In other words, part of this book is to tell you, if King Solomon wrote it, and if he wrote it from the historical perspective, it's King Solomon understands that the honeymoon is not going to last forever, and there's going to be the downturn. I think I mentioned it last time that King Solomon is King Solomon understands that his period is the period of the full moon. And the full moon, where both physically and spiritually, the Jewish people are living out the dream. But after the full moon, the moon begins to wane, and the light diminishes, and there'll be a great descent. And ultimately, we know with the moon, the purpose of the descent is for a rebirth. But the danger is that when the Jewish people are in the descent, in the darkness, they could misinterpret the relationship and feel that the love is no longer there. And the purpose of the end of the books, chapters 6, 7, 8, is to highlight that both from the perspective of the man, as well as the perspective of the woman, as well as the nations of the world who can attest to this, the love is strong, the bond is strong, and the final conclusion is about the different interpretations. But according to some interpretations, the quest is for the reunification that will be in the coming of Mashiach, and that's the conclusion of the book. But the last chunk is sort of talking about and how the love still exists even though there's separation. So the point is, I think it's a very important part of the book, not is to remind us to see the love even within the separation. So that's the general overview of the next section that we're going to discuss. If anybody wants to make any comment or ask a question, please go ahead. Otherwise, we will continue, and I'm not going to read all the verses inside, but I do want to highlight a few of the verses and explain how the commentaries interpreted those verses. And the common theme is that even within the exile, even within the challenges, even within what seems to be darkness and separation and abandonment, but in reality, the love is alive and well and strong.
Rabbi, I do have
Yes.
a question. At the beginning of this story, it's a woman, that is the Jewish people, that are longing for the marriage. But that was never our historical experience. There was always a reluctance in the very beginning that it went back to Abraham, the singular, not the people. So the longing for God sort of steps in the middle of the story in Egypt rather than at the beginning. Was that your understanding of it?
I think that the song, if you read the song in isolation.
Yeah, where does it start historically? That's the question.
Okay, so if you read, in other words, most commentators, Rashi, for example, explains that the beginning of the story is a lot of the beginning of the romance, where the people feel that God is coming to them, is in Egypt. In other words, where do we feel that God comes to us and tries to, pulls us out of our circumstance and takes us on a date? That is Egypt. Now you read the story of the Song of Songs and you read the story of Exodus, and it doesn't exactly line up, because in Exodus you see the people are much less. It's much less about love. In Exodus, it's much more about hesitation, and it's much more about the people being stiff-necked. It's much more about the people sinning. It doesn't paint the scene of a lover. And that's why you can't read Exodus in isolation. That's why King Solomon comes around and says there's another way of reading the story. In other words, when you have a young man and a young woman, and they're trying to what's the word I'm looking for? They're trying to awaken the love, or trying to seduce the other. Seduce is the wrong word, but they're trying to create this relationship. And then the man or the woman are reluctant, and she sends you a text message and says, "I'm not interested." That's the book of Exodus, the text message that says, "I'm not interested." But the book of Solomon says, don't be so literal. You have to understand that beneath that, the love is there and the relationship is there. It could just be that the timing is not right. It could be the way you reached out is not right. It could be that there are other difficulties and other pressures. But make no mistake, don't read everything so dry. You have to look for the poetry. You have to look for the love. So I think that you cannot read any of these books in isolation, because Exodus shows that the Jewish people and God are not always communicating perfectly. In other words, they're not on the same page. But then the question becomes, if we're not on the same page, does that mean that the love is not existent, or does it mean that there are other challenges? And King Solomon reminds us that the relationship between God and the Jewish people all throughout the Torah, the book of Exodus, but even more importantly, all throughout history, even when God was knocking on the door and we were not opening, even when God was, the metaphor was he stuck his hand through the keyhole to try to open up the door. In other words, insist that we repent. And we still did not wake up on time, right? So even then, make no mistake, do not interpret this as people not interested in God. That's not what's happening, because the whole purpose of the song is that the love is there. There is distraction. We're lazy. We don't want to get up. We took a shower. We don't want to get our feet dirty. All kinds of reasons for the disconnect. But if we dig deeper, says Solomon, says the Song of Songs, you'll discover that the love was always there. It's just a question of how do you communicate the love, and whether or not the love is going to change, is going to affect change and allow for this relationship to flourish. Because in addition to love, you need other things for the relationship to last. You need commitment, you need trust, you need people to be able to rely on each other. You need all kinds of ingredients in the relationship. But this book is here to tell you about the love, and how the love, even when it seems that there's abandonment and there's separation and there's distance, there still is the longing and there still is the desire, both of the man and of the woman, to bring about the restore the relationship, and their desire is in the right place. If that makes any sense.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi.
Where'd you go, Rabbi?
Yes.
There you are. All right. It disappeared. I thought something happened with the cloud.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe it's a connection.
Yeah.
I think I'm there.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm reading at chapter 6, and chapter 6 is the first 2 verses. The first 3 verses really are talking from the perspective of, is really the continuation of the previous song. So we're going to start from chapter 6, verse 4. And chapter 6, verse 4, from 4 all the way to verse 9. So the series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 verses is now, again, we're referring to the period of time where there is separation. In other words, the husband, the wife and husband are separated because, again, she didn't open the door. And by the time she opened it, she's walking through the streets, he's gone. So we're going to talk about that's a period of exile. And now, in period of exile, now they start talking about each other, and we hear the perspective of we start with the perspective of the man, and he's talking about the beauty of the woman. And again, all these descriptions are interpreted in the commentators, but we'll read a few verses and we'll see what we make of it. So verse 4, you are fear, my beloved, as Tirzah, comely as Jerusalem, awesome as the bannered legions. Turn away your eyes from me, for they have made me haughty. Your hair is like a flock of goats that stream down from Gilad. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes that come up from the washing, all of which are perfect, and there is no bereavement among them. Your temple is like a split pomegranate from beneath a kerchief. There are 60 queens and 80 concubines and innumerable maidens. My dove, my perfect one, is but one. She is one to her mother. She is the pure one of she who bore her. Daughters saw her and praised her, queens and concubines, and they lauded her. So what are you reading? You're reading that he's praising her. Again, what are the hair and what is the teeth? We can read Rashi and we'll get some interpretation. But what's really happening, in other words, an important point here is verse 8 and 9. There are 60 queens, 80 concubines, innumerable maidens, but my dove, my perfect one, is but one. And again, part of the discussion, we discussed that in the past, is that from the perspective of the bride, the perspective of the beloved woman, she wants to be alone. She doesn't want to be amongst other people. She wants to have a unique relationship. But the reality is that a king cannot have a unique relationship. And in the palace, there are going to be other people and even other wives. And And yet, what he's trying to tell her is that doesn't take away from her unique place. So even though there are many wives and there are many concubines and there are many maidens, and we know King Solomon had 1,000 women, 1,000 wives. So he knew what he's talking about. Nevertheless, he says, this one, you are the singular one, you are the most beloved. And now the question is, what is that? What is the interpretation of that? So the interpretation of that is, what is the relationship with God with the nations of the world who are sometimes the oppressors of the Jews? So the Jewish people want to feel that we are unique, and therefore those who oppress us maybe should not be successful. Maybe they shouldn't see the blessing of God. And what's happening here is that there's a balance here. On one hand, God is telling the Jewish people that there are many wives, there are many concubines, there are many maidens. In other words, we're not the only people on earth. On the other hand, that's verse 8. On the other hand, in verse 9, we say there is something unique about the Jewish people, and that is that we are one. We're the perfect one. Achat means we are in some sense we're unique. So we're not the only ones, but we're the unique ones. And our relationship with God is unique. But unique means that there's something special about us, about the relationship, but not to say that nobody else exists within that relationship. In other words, that other people don't have their own relationship with God. That they absolutely do. Nevertheless, despite God's connection to all the nations of the world, there still is something unique. Achati yonati, my beloved, my dove, is one, and with one to its mother. We need to say that one means sort of in some sense, there's something unique about that relationship between God and the Jewish people. So that is the song of the man to the woman, even though they're in exile, even though you don't see the love. And an important point is addressing one of her chief concerns is that she wants to be unique. He says, you are unique, even though there are others, there's still something uniquely special about you. Okay, there's more to be said about this, but if you want to turn the chapter to chapter 7, and chapter 7, the speaker changes. And who is the speaker at this point in chapter 7? So the commentaries say we're talking about the nations of the world. And it's very interesting. The nations of the world, what is their perspective during the exile? What have the nations of the world told us throughout the exile? So one of the things they tell us, an important thing they tell us, is they can't understand why are the people so committed to God. In other words, wherever we were and throughout the exile, people tried to convince us to abandon God and join the other gods, the other faiths, the other religions. And sometimes they tried to convince us with coercion. Sometimes they tried to convince us through good ways, through bribing us. But in any case, they tell the Jewish people, why are you so committed to your beloved if your beloved is not even here, if your beloved abandoned you? And that is a very powerful question. And that is according to the commentators, that is the beginning of chapter 7, verse 1. And the verse reads as follows: Return, return, O Shulamit. So Shulamit is the name, but the Shulamit means comes from the word Shalem, the wholesome one, the complete one. Return, return, O Shulamit, return, return, and let us gaze upon you. So the commentaries explain what's happening here is Shuvi, is the nations of the world are telling the Jewish people, telling this girl, why are you still in love with this man? Why are you still waiting for him to return? Why are you still, or the interpretation, why are you still waiting for God why are you still loyal to God? Why don't you come to us? And v'nechazebach, and nechazebach literally means we could gaze upon you, but nechazek could also mean we could choose you. In other words, the Medrash says we could appoint you and make you leaders amongst us. And then if you don't so stubbornly cleave to that relationship with your beloved who is not even present. And that's the perspective of the nations of the world. And then the commentaries continue that the second half of the verse is actually the words of the woman. In other words, this is a response. What will you see for the Shulamit, as in the dance of the camps? They translate two camps of the camps. What is the response? So the response is the Jewish people tell the nations of the world, oh, you say we should join you and you'll give us glory. You'll appoint us to be ministers. You'll appoint us to be leaders. But what could you do for us? What could you do for the Shulamit, like the dance of the camps? What's the dance of the camps? So there are different interpretations. But the Medrash's interpretation is, could you do for us what God did for us when we were at Sinai and we traveled through the desert where we were divided into 4 camps, right? Because we read about it in the book of Numbers, which we just concluded, that when the Jewish people traveled through the desert, they had a temple in the center, the tabernacle in the center, and then there were 4 camps on all 4 sides. So evoking the image of the camps is the Jewish people saying, we'll be happy to follow your gods if you can produce for us what we saw at Sinai. What's the mecholat? What's the dance? So the commentary say that's the dancing of the angels at the experience of the revelation at Sinai. In other words, we say the experience of our relationship with God was so, and that we began at Sinai was so powerful that no other experience could recreate that feeling. And therefore, even though right now we don't see that our beloved is not here, even though right now we don't feel that connection, but we're not going to trade in the relationship for another relationship, because this new relationship cannot do for us and cannot recreate that experience that we had when we were with the camps and the dance of the camps. So that's a beautiful concept. And then the rest of the verse is praises from the nations of the world to the beauty. In other words, from the surrounding people from the audience or to the woman, and it's talking about the beauty of how beautiful she is, and a lot of physical and examples. And again, all those examples are interpreted by the commentaries, and each one talks about different aspects that the nations of the world have seen and appreciate within the Jewish people. And of course, the physical metaphor is just a metaphor. And therefore, the commentaries explain that it means different things. Some of it means the Torah, some of it means the Sanhedrin, etc. And we can go through some of those verses if we have a moment. Let's see what happens.
Rabbi, who's talking in 2, 3, and 4? And 5?
7.
Yes.
According to the perspective, we're saying from 2 all the way down to at least 7 or 8, depending on which perspective. But we're talking about, these are the observers. These are the people who say, return, return. Remember in verse 1, we said the verse opens, return, return, O Shulamit. This is the observers, the people around watching this woman saying, why don't you return to us? Why don't you abandon the relationship? And she responds, because I cannot, because you can't recreate that experience. And then the observers, continue to praise her and talk about her beauty. And what, according to the interpretation, is referring to the beautiful things that the Jewish people have. And what they all have in common is basically that the beauty that the nations of the world are praising is the commitment to God and commitment to the commandments, commitment to the Torah, even throughout the exile. So just for an example, I'm just going to give an example that discusses the discusses the commitment of the Jewish people to the Torah and to the Jewish people and to God even throughout the exile. So again, you have all kinds of verses, all the verses that talk about the physical beauty, the thighs, your navel and the breasts, etc., the neck and the eyes, the head, etc. So you have all these examples. I'm just going to bring one. So for example, verse 8, your stature is like a palm tree, and your breasts are like clusters of dates. So what does it mean that Jewish people are like a palm tree? Palm tree stands tall. It's probably the tallest tree in Israel. Maybe there was the Erez, the cedar in Lebanon, but in Israel, Tamar, a palm tree, stands erect, stands tall. The Rashi says this refers to the Jewish people. This refers to the Jewish people who are in the exile, but stand erect, meaning they don't bow to the idols. And it refers specifically to the biblical story of where you had in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and he created the idol in his image, and he made everybody bow to the idol, and yet there were some Jewish people, maybe few, but some, the leaders, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, etc., who would not bow to the idols. So Rashi says that when the nations of the world praise the Jewish people, and they say, as you stand erect like a palm tree, that means not just it's not literal, it's figurative. It means that the Jewish people do not bow to the pressures of the time. And in fact, they remain committed to God despite the pressures. That's the first half of the verse. And then the second half of the verse, Shadayach le'eshkolot, your breasts are like clusters of dates. So the metaphor is, according to Rashi, we refer to the leaders of the Jewish people, those same leaders that stood strong, but they're also nursing the people. In other words, to teach not just the Jewish people, but also the nations of the world. When the Jewish people stand firm and do not bow to the pressure of the nations of the world, and they remain committed to God, that itself nurses and teaches and provides nourishment to the to the people of the world, teaching them about the one God. So again, when you look at the Jewish history, you look persecution. You see people who persecuted the Jews and did not get the message of the Jewish people. But once you put on the glasses of the Song of Songs and you look at it from a deeper perspective, you understand that consciously or subconsciously, the nations of the world did in fact get enlightenment and wisdom from the Jewish people. Even while they were persecuting them, they still were learned from them, and they still learned about the oneness of God. And sometimes that commitment itself angered the people, but on a deep mystical level, that's how we affected the world when the world sees our commitment to God, despite the fact that it seemed that God was not present. So that is how we read the beginning of the first chunk of verses in verse 7. According to Rashi, verse 9 shifts. 9 and 10 is referring to the words of God, and then 11 and on refers to the Jewish people. So again, the speaker keeps shifting. Okay, so we have another few minutes. Let's see if we can make a dash to the end of the book. Let's see if we can do that. Okay, so we skip. This is so verse 9, according to Rashi, is God speaking. I said, right? Because till now we're talking about in the plural, that that the plural, the nations are talking to the Jewish people. Now verse 9 is I said, but it's singular. So now this is clearly the man talking, as we will see in a moment. I said, let me climb up the palm tree, let me seize its boughs, and let your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the fragrance of your countenance like that of apples, and your palate is like the best wine that glides down smoothly to my beloved, making the lips of the sleeping speak. In other words, God says, if the Jewish people, in verse 8, the Jewish people are, the metaphor is that they are like a palm, meaning they stand strong and they're committed to God. So now from the perspective of God, God wants to climb the palm tree. In other words, there's some metaphor of God wants to once again reconnect with the Jewish people and wants to embrace and wants to drink the wine and wants to smell. Again, that's all metaphor of God wanting to restore. God's love still exists throughout the exile, and the same is the same about the Jewish people. So verse 9 is verse 11 is actually very interesting. I am my beloved's, literally, ani ledaidi, I am to my beloved, the alai to shukato, and his desire is upon me. So here, the woman recognizes that even though they're in exile, even though they were not reunited yet, but she recognizes that the beloved's desire is upon her, meaning he wants her as well. And somebody pointed out that if you look at the book of Genesis, you talk about the curse of the woman is Eli Sheikh Teshukatech. Your desire will be to your husband. In other words, that the way it's portrayed in the book of Genesis is that the woman has a deep desire for a relationship with man, and therefore the balance is sort of out of balance, and therefore the man is in some way has power over the woman, because the woman desires her more than the woman desires him more than he desires her. Here it switches. Here it says alai to shukato. Here it says upon me is his desire. His is the masculine. In other words, she is saying, she recognizes that as much as she loves God, God's teshukah, God's desire, is a very strong word, teshukah, God's deep desire is upon her. So now all of a sudden, throughout the exile, the relationship is becoming much more balanced. In the beginning of the relationship, the man, meaning God, is the giver. God does so much more for the people, and the people are receiving, and therefore the relationship is not so balanced. But throughout the exile, when the Jewish people ultimately sort of are more independent in the sense they don't always see God's presence, and yet they're able to remain connected and loyal to God. So one of the things that does, we have all kinds of side effects to that. One side effect is that the Jewish nations of the world are affected. The other side of effect is that the relationship between God and the people itself sort of becomes much more balanced. And God's deep desire is to the people even more than it was earlier, because of what God sees, how the Jewish peoples mature and their connection to him is unshakable. So that's the verse 11. And verse 12 is now the woman coming and telling the beloved, let's go out to the field and let's be together in the field. And this is really a pun. What's happening here is, if you remember in the second song, the man was telling the woman, let's go out to the fields, and it's because everything, all of nature is blossoming. And the woman says, I'm not ready. Now, after the exile, she's ready. And she now is evoking that same image. Let's go out to the field and be together throughout this beautiful nature. So that's verse 12. Come, my beloved, let us go out to the field. Let us lodge in the villages. Let us arise early to the vineyards. Let us see whether the vine has blossomed, the tiny grapes have developed, the pomegranates have lost their flowers. I will give you my love. Right? He's saying, when we get together in the field, there I could give you my love. There I could really show you my true commitment to you. So this is talking about one of two things. Either it's talking about the desire of the Jewish people throughout exile for the future redemption. That's one way of reading it. He says, come, let us go back to the fields, meaning let's go to the future redemption. There I will show you my love. There the marriage will be reestablished. That's one way of reading it. But there's a more interesting way of reading it, and this is Rashi's way. Rashi says we're not talking about the future redemption yet. We're talking about throughout the exile itself. And what the woman is saying to God is, come, why don't we go? Why don't we take a tour throughout the field, and there I will show you my love. What is the field? What is the field? Says Rashi, the field, the vineyard, the place where we get wine. Where do we get the wine? What's wine? Wine is the Torah. So he says, let's go and see whether or not the Jewish people are drinking the wine, are out in the field, are they studying Torah, are they benefiting and enjoying the Torah? And there I will show you my love, meaning there you will see the praise of the Jewish people, because when the Jewish people study Torah, it's not just an intellectual pursuit, it's actually an expression of their love to God. So according to Rashi, it's not talking about, I'll show you my love in the future. It's right now throughout the exile, if you know where to look. If you come out to the field, if you come out to the orchard, what's the orchard? Wine is a metaphor for the intoxicating secrets of the Torah. So he says, come to the orchard, there I will show you my love. There you will see, like Rashi says, Shavach Banai Abanosai, the praise of my sons and daughters. So in other words, within the exile, she says, come God, look at our praise. Look how I'm showing you my love, even throughout the exile. So that's beautiful. And with 3 minutes overtime, we'll go another few minutes. And hopefully we'll make a run to the end for the end of the book. And again, we'll continue next week, go more in depth. We'll see already, but I just want to at least get a general overview. And then clearly when you get to chapter 8, verse 1, if you turn the page in the Chabad.org, hit the next clip, there you will see there you will see once again in the simple story what she is telling him. I want to get together again, and we want to reestablish the relationship. So I'm going to read some of the verses. I'm going to read verse 1, 2, 3, and then skip to verse 6 and see what's happening here. So again, we're not going to cover everything, but here we go. Oh, that you were like my brother. In other words, me, oh, is like I wish you were like my brother who sucked my mother's breasts. I would find you outside, I would kiss you, and they would not despise me. I will lead you, I will bring you to the house of my mother who instructed me. I will give you to drink some spiced wine of the juice of my pomegranates. His left hand would be under my head, and his right hand would embrace me. What is she saying? Why they have a romantic relationship. Why is she saying that I want you to be like my brother? So one theory is that the problem with romantic relationships is that they have ups and downs, as we see throughout the story. The advantage of the relationship with a brother, and she says, let's go back to our mother's house, sibling, the love is much more natural, and ultimately you can't get rid of it because it's a natural thing and you're always connected. So in some ways what she's saying is, can we get together in a way that not running away into hiding out, but could we get married and could we establish the relationship in a way that it will be like a sibling that will never part? And that's what she says, nobody is going to despise me, because at least in those days, when brothers and sisters would show affection in public, nobody thought that strange. When spouses did, that wasn't so common. So she's saying, I want to have that relationship reestablished. She repeats that theme in verse 6 of chapter 8. Place me like a seal on your hearts, like a seal on your arm. For love is as strong as death, zeal is as strong as the grave. Its coals are coals of fire of a great flame. She's saying, I want to be a seal on your heart. What does it mean, a seal on your heart? I want everybody to see the love you have. I want you to reveal the love you have, and everybody should see my special place in your heart, in your life. That's a stamp on your heart. And that is again, the Jewish people's quest for the reestablishing of the relationship in the future.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
John had an interesting comment about the different kinds of love. This is erotic love, and so much of this is about that other kind of love, agape, which is love of God, more transcendent love. So it seems to me, your comment, that they're using erotic love as the metaphor for love of God.
Right. So that's very interesting because, and in other words, we want erotic love, but we want the advantage of a natural love, of a sibling love. And the advantage is that it stays the same. It's consistent and it's established. So in other words, what the Jewish people want is eventually, after the exile, we want permanence. And that's the metaphor of a brother. Now, if you look at the Bible, if you look at the 5 books of Moses, the metaphor between God and Jewish people is a metaphor of parent and child, right? God says, you are my B'ni B'chari Yisrael, you are my firstborn Israel. And a lot of times the metaphor is used about God as a father. And again, father, there's a hierarchy, and it's natural love, and it doesn't change. Once you get to the prophets, things change. In the book of the prophets, the metaphor is usually, there's a little bit of father-son relationship, but most of the metaphors in the prophets, including in the writings, including in this book, it goes to the extreme, but it's not new here. All the prophets use the metaphor of a spouse. And the metaphor of the spouse is the erotic love. And the erotic love has a cost. The cost is, if your father, you're supposed to submit. At least I don't know about today, but in those days, you listen to what your father said. And that was the relationship. In the beginning of our relationship, we're still very young. What's our relationship with God? God tells us what to do, we accept and we do it. That is a parent-child relationship. But then the relationship advances. You come into Israel. Now, you're no longer a child listening to a parent. Now you're a spouse. Now you're more of an equal. Now you have more autonomy. Now the autonomy has a certain advantage. You can get erotic love, because if I'm my own person and I'm separate from you, then the love can be awakened. On the other hand, the downside of the erotic love is that there could also be rejection, and there could be concealment, because you can't divorce your parent, but you could separate from your spouse. And that's really what's happening in the book. The fact that we're getting to the point is that's the challenge in the story of love. On one hand, the relationship is much more profound. On the other hand, it's much harder to maintain the love throughout the entire book. Love has the ups and downs. So what we talk about is that there's going to be separation, there's going to be difficulty, there's going to be times when my beloved is knocking on the door and we don't open, and followed by the separation. But the most interesting thing about separation is that when you look at separation, you think that it's an obstacle to love. But what we're seeing here is that the separation intensifies the love, right? Now that she and he are more committed than they were earlier. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to ignore the downturns, but we're trying to get that the separation, the longing, the exile should be an intensifier of the love, to the point where it says that we're reading the end of verse 8, Ma'im Rabim, great waters, let me find the verse. The great verse 7 in chapter 8, many waters cannot quench the love, nor can rivers flood it. Should a man give all his property of his house for love, they would despise him. But the point is, now the love is so powerful, nothing could get in the way. Once we ride all the waves, once we feel the distance, and the distance intensifies the love, now the love ultimately in the future will become, it will reach a state where the love will be, the relationship will be restored, and there'll be no more downturns. That's the coming of the Mashiach. We didn't have time to read everything here. I'm just going to read the final verse. Flee, my beloved, and liken yourself to a gazelle or to a fawn of the Hinds on the Spice Mountains. Same metaphor used earlier in the book about the exile, about God coming to us, taking us out of exile, running like a gazelle, meaning to say God is running to us, even though we're not yet necessarily worthy. Now that same metaphor is used here. We're talking about brach doidi, flee my beloved, meaning leave. Rashi says, leave the exile and take us with you. And that's the conclusion of the book. We didn't read everything. We have to figure out what we'll do in the future if we want to go back and revisit some of the points here. So look out for the email with the information. But what is the big takeaway here, at least from today's section? The big takeaway is, how do you read? How do you respond to the separation? How do you respond to to the seeming abandonment of the exile. The wrong way to respond is to say that it's really abandonment and the love is no longer there. The correct way to respond is that this is a time where the love is actually intensified. And ironically, the love is more intensified in the time of separation than it was during the marriage, during the wedding itself. The wedding itself, the love was not complete. As we see that shortly after, there was the scene where he's knocking on the door, she's not opening. And during the exile, we tell God, come out, see our commitments. The nations of the world see our commitment to God. They see that we stand erect like the palm. They see that we don't want to join them, even though they promised us all sorts of glory. We say, we would love to come with you if you can reproduce that feeling we had at Sinai. And you can't. And of course, the end is, at least according to Rashi, when we tell God, come to the fields, come to the vineyard, come to the vineyards, and we will show you there. I will show you my love. Two interpretations. Either it means bring us back to Israel, bring us home. The love will be reestablished, or it means within the exile, come to the study halls, come to see if the grapes ripened, come to see if the children are still studying Torah. There you will see and you will feel and experience our love to you. So that's the story. The story is, when you look at history, you can look at it through the actual dry events. That's history, but you have to look at it through poetry. That's the Song of Songs. You have to see that within everything that we experience, the love to God is there, is present. And that's why, as King Solomon said, if all the books are holy, the Song of Songs is the holy of holies, deeper and more profound than the other books, because here is where we discover that the love has always been there. So this is the story in short. Again, we're not doing justice, even not even reading all the verses and all the Rashis. Maybe we'll do so in the future. But in any case, so far, thank you for joining me on the journey. I gained a lot. I learned a lot. I never studied this book as much as I should have. And this is hopefully will be a good beginning. And I appreciate everybody's joining us. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. And we hope to see you in good health in the future.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I wonder about the arguments about including this book in the canon.
Yes.
Yes. So that maybe that's for another time.
We mentioned it briefly. In other words, there is a machlekas, there's a disagreement. It's in the Mishnah. There's a disagreement. Some people say that Song of Songs is an opinion that says the Song of Songs is not holy, and therefore they said that there's a certain. It's a little ironic, but there's an impurity. The holy books were made you impure. Why that is another story, because we want you to be, without getting into the technicalities, that some sages say that the Holy of Holies don't make your hands impure. The Torah scroll makes your hands impure. I know it sounds strange, but that's the law. The law would be because in those days people would put the truma, the tithings, which was food and holy, they would put it next to the holy books because they both have to be holy. Then the mice would come and eat the holy books and eat the holy food. And after they finished eating the holy food, they also ate the holy books. So the rabbi said, we don't want you to putting the holy books next to the holy food. So therefore, if the holy books touch the holy food, the holy books make the food impure. That's the technical aspect. But the question becomes whether or not the Song of Songs, in fact, actually would make you impure, which that's another way of saying, is the Song of Songs holy? And the rabbis say there's a disagreement. And then King Solomon says there's no disagreement. King Solomon says it's actually more holy than the other books. And how could King Solomon say there's no argument if there was an argument? So one way to think about it is King Solomon says, well, in other words, the argument is, should we consider this book holy if people studying it won't necessarily see the divine wisdom and the divine prophecy within the book? So some people say there's no point of declaring it holy because then people would just see, oh, it's just a romantic novel. What's the point of making that holy? King Solomon then says there was never an argument. In other words, there was never an argument because, not King Solomon, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says there was never an argument because he says, if you look at the deeper meaning, everybody would acknowledge that it's Holy of Holies. Why is it Holy of Holies, like I said? Because you get the deeper meaning of reality, and the deeper meaning of reality, you would see that within all the events of the Jewish people, within all the events of history, within all the ups and downs of the romantic story, the love has always been there.
Thank you, Rabbi. I must have
Thank
to.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.